Alright, so back on the issue of sharpening the cheap-ass bayonets, okay? Um, these things come so dull, there is no way you will get progress using regular sharpening stones. It's not going to happen. One of the problems you run into with grinders, using grinders to sharpen... excuse me. One of the problems you're going to run into using grinders to sharpen knives is that grinders tend to concentrate heat on the part that they're working on. And if you're dealing with really hard tool steel, maybe it doesn't really matter. Some people will say that using a grinder actually enhances the heat treatment on the steel. And then there's some grinders that are specifically made for knife sharpening. And if you want to go spend, $100, $200 on a knife sharpening grinder, yeah, hey, more power to you. My thing is, I've discovered that they still don't always give the edge that I want. Although some of them out there are really good. If you have your basic home workshop, one tool that's not very expensive, I suggest getting into, is a Benchtop Sander. Okay, these things get really useful for a lot of stuff. This one's from Harbor Freight, and it's not a very good one. I'll be honest with you. When I try to do wood with this, if you press wood into it really hard, it'll stop the belt. It's not all that strong. It's got the little wheel thing on the side, doesn't even stay tight. I bought this one new, although you could probably get these things at garage sale for $15, $10. I think new, $39, $49. The thing is, these things are great for sharpening stuff. What you're going to do is you're going to put a fine belt on there. You'll never use the coarse belt for sharpening anything. And because the belt has such an incredible huge amount of surface area, it doesn't build up heat on the knife very much. And so I was going to demonstrate sharpening one of these in real time. The problem is it makes too much noise for me to narrate the video. But I'm going to turn it on a little bit. I'm using solar power here. So I turn on my inverter first. And sometimes my solar system doesn't get enough power to kickstart these, so I kickstart it by hand. That one went. Saw the lights blink. That was because there was a voltage drop from the power draw. Now this thing, unlike your grinder, if you're working close to this and you accidentally touch it, alright, it's not the end of the world. Alright, it's not the end of the world if this catches your finger. But in sharpening a knife, what you're going to find is you need to press down on this to get some action. Okay, if you're going to really try to sharpen that knife, you need to press down on this to get some action, and that knife will start to get warm. Usually have an adjustment if you're trying to wear this belt one way or the other way. And again, we're using a relatively fine belt to reshape the edges on these knives. Now, a custom knife maker who did some work for me years ago and made this knife for me. This was a prototype for a knife that was eventually under dispute, but this was, we called this the Osi Survival Knife. It was later published on the internet as what it is. I never took out a patent on the design. It's kind of hard to put a patent on the design, although there's a trademark on the name, mainly because it was based on my name. And Cold Steel put these into production without giving me or Lowell Lockett, the guy who built it for me, proper credit. However, when I had Mr. Lockett make this knife, I designed it, he made it. He had a full knife forging outfit over at his house. And he's a master knife maker from the Knife Maker Guild. He was the one that showed me how to shape blades using belt sanders. And he would have a series of belt sanders set up at his place that are actually free running, so you can get a little curve on that. Now this has a platform on it that keeps it flat. And that's good when you're doing blades in that profile, but Mr. Lockett was making several different profiles of blades, uses different belt sanders, different materials and grits in shaping these. And he hand forges the blades, which means that he's heating these things up in an oven. getting them nice and red hot and using a real anvil to hammer a lot of that edge out. And by doing that, that basically packs down the steel, makes it more dense, so that when you do go to sharpen it, it's different. And he showed me how when you go to sand or sharpen steel that's been hand forged, it was packed down and made more solid when it was packed down, compared to steel that wasn't. They show sparks differently. There is a difference on that. But if you're using a high grade steel to begin with, it's not the end of the world. So let's say on this knife, if I wanted to put a back edge on here, I got to use a power tool for that. I don't really want to use a grinder, although you can use a grinder when you're trying to bring down an edge on something that never had an edge, like this shovel here. Okay, I used a grinder to get these edges, just because these edges are almost 1/8 of an inch thick, and if you got to remove a lot of fucking material, you might as well use a grinder. And so I went a long time grinding the edges on this shovel before I even got to the point where I was doing this. But you know what? This is a shovel, not a knife. Okay, and I'm only going to go so far as to be able to make this thing a little bit more usable as kind of a machete, axe. A little more dangerous as a weapon when you sharpen all the edges around there. However, good maintenance on shovels involves sharpening shovels. Anybody thinks you dig a hole better with a dull shovel has not dug a lot of holes. Okay, and so on touching this up, I can use this thing as a sharpener. Now, that's a rough tool. But getting back to the knives, you notice when I sharpen this thing, I'm not necessarily doing a lot like this. I'm doing it at an angle, and then you work it up on a curve. You do it at an angle, you work it up on a curve. You do it at an angle. Now, on a real knife maker sander, this belt's going to be free hanging, so it can follow the contour on your knife, on your metal a little better. This is flat. It was made for flattening wood and stuff. Okay, but you get a little bit of an open area right here, and that's a spot where you can work with your knife. You can work that angle, work those new angles, and get that in there. And that's about right for sharpening one of these bayonets, and you can get a lot of action on there. Now, you're only going to get so far with this before you're just removing a lot of material, and you want to start finishing that edge. And before we get into any sharpening stones, you got to realize the sharpening stones in our society are small. If you look at museums, you look at ancient society, people that had to sharpen big tools and axes and swords and stuff like that, and they didn't have power tools for it. They had sharpening stones that were big. Okay, and the reason is you can treat a lot of surface area on that edge in a short period of time with a big stone. Now, I don't keep a lot of sharpening stones around, and in ancient days, sharpening stones would last 100 years, 1,000 years. If you had a 1,000-year-old sharpening stone, big old piece of sandstone or something like that, passed down through the family, or maybe placed in the middle of the village, the older it was, the better it was, because they get all the little irregularities out of the stone, and it would be a sharpening stone forever. However, in our society, we can do things with disposable stuff. I want to have a lot of surface area available when I go to sharpen one of these knives. And again, what I'm doing is I'm trying to take the roughness off that edge. I'll have a lot of lines in there from using the belt sander. Again, we can only get these belts down to a certain level of fineness. I'm going to start out with this 320 grit sandpaper, although realistically you could probably use 400 grit paper, 600 if you can get it, and you start working that edge. Now you notice, now this edge I already worked with a few different grits of paper, but you notice that you get this stuff comes off. All right, that's the steel that came off and got on that sandpaper. That's the irregularities, the high points. We're beginning to polish that edge, make that edge sharper, more regular, and we're going to work that whole area with a whole knife, because we're not going to fuck around with some little honing stone. All right, we're working that whole big area with that knife, and don't be afraid to press down and work that thing to force those edges to contour with what you want them to do. Press it down and work with it. Now, once you've gotten to the point where you think it's as sharp as it can be on this grit, okay, this is 320 grit, we're going to go to a finer grit. Now, again, we get into sandpaper. Here's 1000 grit, ultra fine. Here's 1200 grit. 1200 grit is where you get into blade polishing. Okay, this is where you can do stuff with 1200 grit and get those mirror finishes. And what I've gotten to the point with all these knives, okay, all these knives is I can touch them up with a piece of 1200 grit sandpaper, get a lot of action out of them, everything's good. Now, this custom knife, very sharp, although it's not really shaving sharp. I can work with this with a 1200 grit paper. I'll get it shaving sharp. How long is it going to stay that way? It's a little bit hard to say, depending on what I'm cutting. Now, I designed this as a survival knife mainly for processing game and as a fighting knife. I did not make this as a wood chopper. I will not cut firewood with this knife, okay? I designed it with a thinner blade that would be a little bit closer to the profile of a kitchen knife. Again, because I've tried using big, thick survival knives in the kitchen. Didn't get as far with them. Can't do the precision cuts on vegetables and stuff like that you can get with a you can't do it with a thick blade. You can do it with a thin blade. But when I'm sanding this, I can have sandpaper around in my vehicle. I can have sandpaper attached to some blocks of wood, just flat pieces of scrap wood, and that's how I'll touch up my blades in the field without the weight of having sharpening stones around. But you got to realize the sandpaper is always going to be disposable. But when we get back into these cheap blades, something you want to have maybe in a cache or leaving a vehicle where it's not all that secure, and you don't want to put high value stuff at risk, but you want to have complete survival kits placed in different places. These cheap knives, they work. They're versatile. You got the wire cutter thing here. That's kind of a neat little gimmick. Again, you got to watch your fingers on that. Do not choke up on the grip. You will get fucked up. All right. But these things are versatile if you can sharpen them, and you're not ruining anything if you take a little weight off that blade. The way the profile is up here, it's a little screwed up to begin with. So if you take that profile down differently, you're not doing any harm whatsoever. But that's my sandpaper belt sander method of sharpening knives. I was introduced to it by a master knife craftsman. I'm going to start getting into making my own knives, maybe selling them. But right now, for somebody who wants to do survival on a budget, have some fighting knives on a cheap budget. These AK bayonets, you can get them on eBay and all that. They're cheap. The steel seems like it's decent. It's not wonderful, but it's decent. The other thing is, if you can find super fine grit polishing things for these, you're going to be that much ahead of the game. And when you work angles on here, all right, the more slender, the more dagger-like you might be using a blade. We do this kind of angle to rip down a lot of metal, but when you start really wanting to hone that thing, you're going to start backing that angle off to more like this sort of thing, and then bringing it down. But when you bring it down to this part of the wheel, it tends to want to stagger it a little bit. So you want to kind of work the flat as best you can, and sometimes you're going to nick that little hilt, but again, it's just an old bayonet. It is possible to undo the screws and make your own handle for these things. However, don't discount the utility of that original handle. So hopefully you watch this video, you learned a little bit about sharpening knives in a hurry, especially if you're doing a production schedule, you're making knives, you want to do a production schedule, you want to get a lot of knives sharp in a hurry so you can sell them in a manner which makes you more than $5 an hour, okay? Using a belt sander, okay, the way to go. Using regular sheets of cheap sandpaper, these are like $2.50 a pack. This is how you get that final honed edge on it there. And then, you know, this sandpaper here was 320 grit. I kind of would prefer to use 400 grit. And then you can get stuff. This is silicon carbide. Some of these will be a diamond grit. They don't have a problem cutting into the metal. Okay, there's no law against sanding steel. You want to wash your hands, not have the stuff around food. It's probably not good to ingest. If it's plain old iron, it doesn't hurt you to have some of that in your diet. If it's steel that has some of the other chemicals in there, that's not a good thing. Okay, so you want to clean up when you're done, not have that dust around your food. Anyway, I think that'll be it for this video.